The 2023 film, May-December, marks the fifth collaboration between director Todd Haynes and actress Julianne Moore. Their creative partnership, which stretches back nearly 30 years to 1995's Safe, has been a talking point for years now, each complementing the other for the rigor and complexity of their work. In 2017, at the premiere of their fourth collaboration, Wonderstruck, Haynes went so far as to call her his creative soulmate.
We were a lot younger when we did Safe, but I was stunned by this sense that I found a kind of soulmate, a creative soulmate, who understood this almost unimaginable character on the page of a script I'd written.
A sentiment Moore echoes when she talks about him.
I feel so fortunate to have had this creative partnership. It's like something that you wish for as an actor, and it often doesn't come true. And the fact that I've had this with Todd is unbelievably meaningful and moving to me, so I'm forever and ever grateful.
Clearly, this is a working relationship both artists value deeply, one that they're willing and ready to return to at any opportunity. So what is it about their partnership that makes it so fruitful and fulfilling? What exactly do Todd Haynes and Julianne Moore bring out in each other? Sure, some of it is that inexplicable, unspoken understanding between two highly creative individuals that only they could ever really comprehend. And some of it could only be perceived by observing their dynamic on set, watching each inspire or interpret the other. But over the years, they've left some clues in interviews that can give us insight into their processes and help us determine why and how their partnership is so rich. That's what I hope to explore in this video. Before we get started, I'd like to thank Mubi for sponsoring today's video. Mubi is a curated streaming service dedicated to elevating great cinema from around the globe. Get a whole month free at mubi.com/bekindrewind. In the early 1990s, Julianne Moore was an actress on the rise. She'd gained national recognition as a regular on the soap opera As the World Turns, playing, at first, Franny Hughes, and eventually her evil British half-sister Sabrina as well.
Please don't be frightened. Who are you?
Moore was so adept at making her characters' melodramatic existences plausible that in 1988 she was awarded a Daytime Emmy. And when she eventually left the show, they had to hire two different actresses to replace her. Following her stint on As the World Turns, she performed in regional theater, off-Broadway, and small roles in films, notably The Hand That Rocks the Cradle, The Fugitive, and what am I gonna do, not mention Body of Evidence?
Wish me luck.
By this point, director Robert Altman had seen Moore in a unique production of Uncle Vanya that had been performed for small, intimate audiences. He loved her and cast her in his 1993 film Shortcuts as a kind of free-spirited painter whose marriage is going through a rough patch. This film, along with the filmed version of Uncle Vanya, not to mention the endorsement of Robert Altman to any director who'd listen, gave Moore artistic credibility, and her name began to circulate as an exciting up-and-coming actress, someone perhaps an up-and-coming director might want to work with. In the early 1990s, Todd Haynes was a director on the rise, though his ascent had been far more contentious than Moore's. His breakout film Superstar: The Karen Carpenter Story, a musical biopic that uses Barbies to explore Karen's struggle with anorexia nervosa, attracted cease and desist letters from both Mattel and the Carpenter estate. To this day, it cannot legally be screened in public, although it is on YouTube and one of the greatest things I've ever seen, so go watch it while you can. His first feature film, 1991's Poison, also courted controversy. A major work in the then burgeoning new queer cinema movement, the film became a mainstream news item when Reverend Donald Wildman, president of the American Family Association, wrote to members of Congress to complain that it had been partially funded by a federal grant, and to denounce the film for including explicit porno scenes of homosexuals involved in anal sex.
Did I miss something? There didn't seem to be anything really explicit there. I mean, there is a scene of two men having sex, and you see them from the waist up. And
right.
as I recall, they're wearing shirts.
Yeah. No, it's completely inaccurate, and he admits that he has never seen the film, and he's basing his allocations on a Variety review of the film, which, although it was a very positive review, also kind of misrepresented the way the sex is depicted in Poison and made it sound a lot more dangerous and hardcore than it is. It doesn't even approach the kind of scenes that we see typically in R-rated films out of Hollywood.
Now, after the critical success but cultural rollercoaster ride of Poison, Haynes was readying his second feature film, Safe. The film follows Carol White, a seemingly typical Southern Californian suburban housewife of the late 1980s. She exercises, decorates her home, meets with friends, gardens, but suddenly her health begins to rapidly deteriorate. Although she exhibits increasingly strange and extreme symptoms, her doctors are unable to find anything physically wrong with her. Believing she is allergic to the 20th century, she eventually retreats to an isolated community called Wrenwood, where gurus spout New Age ideologies about acknowledging their pain. Carol is unable to cope or adapt, and finally moves into a sterile igloo as a last-ditch attempt at a cure. To Haynes, the success of the entire film hinged on the performance of Carol White, which he acknowledged would be no easy task for whoever got the role. I don't think I ever wrote or conceived of a more challenging character on the page for an actor to embody than Carol White, he said in one 2014 interview. There's so many barriers set up for the viewer's access to her that we usually come to expect from movies, not the least of which is the fact that she's not a very fleshed out or interesting person. It's true, the screenplay of Safe is rather spare and minimal. Events are described quite literally. It details Carol's physical reactions, but offers few clues about her internal life, and even fewer answers about her health. As John Lair put it in The New Yorker, is it chemical, biological, psychosomatic? I was coy, I was tricky, Haynes said. I wanted to touch that little bit in everyone where you just aren't convinced that who you think you are is really who you are. That moment when you feel like a forgery. Because the screenplay was so ambiguous, most actors who auditioned filled in the gaps for themselves, imprinting a personality and perspective on the character rather than leaving her vague and unknowable. Haynes told Sight and Sound, a lot of very talented name actors read for the part, but they loved the dialogue, so they indulged in all these naturalistic tics that made you just hate the character. I knew the part had to be played in a very restrained way, and Julianne understood that instinctively and intellectually. As Moore tells it, she was in Philadelphia filming Roommates when she first read the script for Safe. Absolutely entranced by it, and in utter disbelief that the role had not yet been cast, she flew up to New York City to audition for Haynes.
I knew exactly who she was, and I thought, and I haven't had this experience, that often in my career either, where I was like, I know this person, I know who this is, and I'm not even going. Even if he wants me to do something differently with this, I'm not going to be able to because this is what's on the page. It was very, very clear that she's someone who's just trying not to take up any space at all.
She read a few scenes, and by the time she left, Haynes had his Carol White. Moore made a couple of choices in her audition that caught his attention. The first was her voice.
I had this idea about the way she should speak, that I wanted the character not to put any weight on her larynx at all. What was clear to me is that this is a person who doesn't have a voice.
Yeah.
So I was going to start there, and like I said, talk right on top of my vocal cords. So that means they don't ever vibrate. So like when I'm talking right now, there's a vibration. The lower you go, the more they vibrate.
Right.
But if you're never on them at all, it's almost like you can't breathe.
This characterization appears in the finished film. Moore's voice is much higher and more diminutive than it usually sounds.
No. We wanted teal. We ordered teal, but we received black.
There's no authority or passion to her delivery. She is thoroughly passive, unsure. Her body language reinforces this. She holds herself rigidly, her posture upright, her limbs always close to her body. In every conceivable way, Carol makes herself smaller, less present. Describing her audition in a recent interview, Haynes said, all of a sudden, with that voice and cadence and iridescent skin and coloring, the conceptual idea of the movie that was built around this void was filled in by what I heard and how uncannily she personified this vacant person. how thoroughly her conception of the character completed mine. When you watch Safe, you can see exactly what he means. Her performance pairs perfectly with the visual language used by Haynes. There are almost no close-ups in the entire film. Long, static, wide shots dwarf Carol in the frame, and as Roy Grundman wrote in Cineast, convey the emptiness of her life and her isolation. Haynes makes her another piece of furniture, completely consumed by her environment in more ways than one. The effect is haunting and deeply unsettling, and leaves the audience with no satisfying answers. That Moore was able to immediately understand this vision by reading that screenplay is highly impressive, and having watched and read innumerable interviews with Haynes over the past month, I'm not even sure that he knows how she did it. Still, this seems to be a consistent experience for Moore with his work. She reads his screenplays and they somehow instantly click.
And our experience, like from that moment on, we just don't talk about stuff. What he writes is sort of what I do, and we have kind of an emotional shorthand or something, which is really an exciting way to work. We just sort of see everything eye to eye.
More specifically, she likes to say that she can hear what he's written.
I think I have an affinity for your material, and I feel like I can hear it. And I felt like I knew from the language how she should sound. I had a really clear idea of it.
So how exactly is that possible? I'd argue that their common language comes from their relationships to genre. Since the release of Superstar in 1988, Todd Haynes has emerged as a master manipulator of genre, not just playing with their aesthetics, but with their politics and logic. How do horror films from the 1950s stir panic, and about what kinds of things? How might the audience receive a standard biopic if it were enacted by dolls? What endings do we expect from a film about illness? Extraordinarily well-versed in film history, Haynes' work demonstrates a strong interest in popular form combined with a strong desire to invert it. He almost always includes very specific visual references to other films, deploying these references in precise, meaningful ways that draw parallels from genre to genre, from past to present. This is true of Safe, for example. In the early 1990s, the disease movie of the week had become popular on American television. A protagonist, usually a woman, would be diagnosed with an illness, which would then teach her something important about herself in the midst of her suffering. Illness, therefore, equals enlightenment. It bears a message. It becomes about taking personal responsibility for sickness. Haynes found this implication troubling, particularly in the midst of the AIDS crisis. So he wrote a screenplay that presents no such tidy narrative arc. By denying the satisfying, expected dramatic beats of the disease movie, the film becomes a prescient commentary on self-help culture, a metaphor for the AIDS crisis, a drama about class and social estrangement, and a horror film about what you cannot see. There's no question, he wrote, that the tone of the film, the coolness of its style, and the inaccessibility of its central character unsteadies the disease movie genre. At times, it feels more like a domestic horror flick. If Haynes is a master manipulator of genre, it would make sense that his creative soulmate would need to have a keen understanding of genre as well. Moore doesn't speak about film in the academic, intellectual terms the way Haynes does. Does anyone? So it's not as if she sits down, reads the script, and is like, oh yes, I understand this because we discussed it in my semiotics class in college. But I do think it's enlightening when she says she can hear his scripts. It suggests that she recognizes patterns of behavior, characteristics, tropes. Moore often mentions that because her father was in the Army, her family moved around a lot when she was a kid, 23 times worldwide to be precise. And she directly credits her abilities to observe, adapt, and mimic to this lifestyle.
Behavior means different things, but you change it depending on where you are, who you are, what you want to accomplish. That's what you learn very quickly, is that I would go to one school and everybody would dance one way. So you'd go to the new school and you'd go to the school dance and you'd look at the gym and you'd notice that no one picked up their feet at that school, that they just shuffled their feet when they danced. So you're like, okay, so that's the way you dance here. So once again, you learn there's no one way to do anything. It just depends on where you are. It depends on what the rules of that community are.
What you begin to realize after watching a billion Julianne Moore interviews is that she can apply that careful, attentive eye she honed as the perpetual new kid to cinema, to visual storytelling. If Haynes is a great manipulator of genre, then Moore is a great observer of genre, able to identify characteristics specific to different kinds of films. This person should act this way because this is what their world looks like and sounds like. Like him, she has a library of films in her mind that she references in very precise ways. For example, she'll talk about being 10 years old living in Juneau, Alaska, and remembering a scene from One Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich.
If you're, Ivan Denisovich, and you are in prison, and you reach down and you pull up a fisheye in your soup, like I remember that very distinctly, that communicates a different kind of experience to you right away, and you've done that visually with a fisheye in a spoon, or when you watch Cassavetes films and the way people relate, and it was something that kind of honed my interest in behavior and in performance. So I became interested less in a theatrical kind of performance and more of a cinematic one.
For example, listen to how she talks about reading the script for Far From Heaven for the first time.
It was another one of those instances where I read something and I'm like, I think I understand the tone. I'm very sensitive to Todd's ideas. I feel like I see him clearly, but also we've all been so cultured by those movies. Like we all grew up with those movies on TV, and there was a certain kind of sound that they had, a certain kind of like way they spoke and moved. And Todd was using those ideas and those tropes.
She hears it because she knows it. Speaking of, in the years since the release of Safe, Julianne Moore had soared to prominence, becoming one of the most exciting actresses of the late 90s with a series of well-regarded performances in films like Boogie Nights, The Big Lebowski, and Magnolia. She also earned her first 2 Oscar nominations, Best Supporting Actress in 1998 for Boogie Nights and Best Actress in 2000 for The End of the Affair. Haynes returned to the world of 1970s pop culture with Velvet Goldmine, the story of a bisexual glam rocker named Brian Slade, very loosely based on David Bowie, who fakes his own death. Although the film has become rather respected in the years since its initial release, the critical reception at the time was decidedly more mixed. Where Janet Maslin at the New York Times appreciated that Mr. Haynes surrounded Slade with implicit questions about art and inspiration, truth and honesty, passion and repression, Roger Ebert considered it a clumsy mishmash of references. It's not a career film or a rags to riches film, or an expose, or an attack, or a dirge, or a musical, but a little of all of those, he wrote, chopped up and run through a confusing assortment of flashbacks and memories. Around this time, Haynes found himself returning to the films of Douglas Sirk, a German director remembered primarily for his luscious Hollywood melodramas of the 1950s. At a time in which conservative politics had regained fervent popularity, the early George W. Bush administration, Haynes was drawn to the ambiguities and unsatisfying endings of Sirk's films that draw attention to oppressive cultures through their female characters. He wrote, unlike more respected dramatic forms that hinge on catharsis and breakthrough, classic melodrama is not about overcoming. The women in these films never transcend their conditions, either in thought or in deed. Rarely are we even sure what it is they learn from their struggles. That's because despite its narrative over-determination and simplicity, classic melodrama is not prescriptive. If it has a message to proclaim, it's always, at the very least, a supremely mixed one. Haynes wanted to write one for himself, and he wanted to write one for Julianne Moore. He headed to Portland and wrote a script in 2 weeks. He said in a recent interview, "What I played with while finding a narrative that fulfilled what I loved best about great melodrama was a story of human conflict in which there was no villain, no figure who, if removed from the equation, would make everything okay. In all great melodrama, society is the villain, the system in which these people live. I wanted a tangle of characters wherein one person's tiny step outside the norms toward their desires would upset all the others involved. What I wanted was a kind of diagram of pain. The result was Far From Heaven." Based loosely on Sirk's 1955 film All That Heaven Allows, Far From Heaven brings us into the home of Kathy and Frank Whitaker. On the surface, they appear like a typical 1950s suburban couple. But Frank has a secret. One night he calls to say that he's staying late at the office. When Kathy arrives to bring him dinner, she unexpectedly finds him in the arms of another man. Meanwhile, Kathy becomes close to their gardener, Raymond. As their nosy neighbors increasingly notice Raymond and Kathy together, rumors begin to spread about a potential romance, and they alienate Kathy and her children from their community. While Frank must decide whether to repress or embrace his sexuality, Kathy must maintain the home and determine whether she can balance the town's racist abuse with her own desires. Haynes planned to explicitly invoke the aesthetics of 1950s Hollywood via Cirque in Far From Heaven, articulating emotion through style. The swelling orchestral score, jewel-toned technicolor, practical set pieces, pristine wardrobes. Far From Heaven would be a melodrama, but it would also be a simulation of a melodrama. The extreme artificiality would be the point. As Amy Taubin wrote in Film Comment, what makes Far From Heaven more than a stylistic tour de force is Haynes' attention to the fact that appearances are as much expressions of desire as they are cover-ups. Far From Heaven short-circuits nostalgia by showing us the ugly social reality masked by now fetishized 50s surfaces and objects. He's exposing the cracks in the American ideal and tracing them to the margins, from clandestine gay bars to suburban homes where black waiters serve whites who never see them. In some sense, Haynes' decision to make such a stylistically bold film was a huge risk. As he put it, how could a film that resurrects the most discredited of dramatic forms ever be trusted by a largely jaded contemporary culture? Haynes knew some snickering was unavoidable, but believed that if he focused on hitting the correct emotional notes, he could still affect an audience with an admittedly outmoded style. He wrote in an essay, "Despite the script's allegiance to the formalities of its time, it must connect emotionally with a contemporary audience in order to succeed. In other words, once rapturously designed and polished, the film will be played straight. The subtlety of the performances will be key." An admirer of the restraint Moore brought to Safe, Haynes knew she could ground and modulate heightened material. Remember that quote from the New York Times about Moore's time on a soap opera? She was adept at making her characters' melodramatic existences plausible. This is what she achieves in Far From Heaven. As Rebecca Gordon writes, Moore understood from the outset that Haynes' intention was to revisit the 1950s Hollywood melodrama not as a realist drama, but as a style, including performance style.
But I did say to him, I said, let's just do a really quick read through because I want to make sure that I hear it the way that you hear it, right? Like, can we just do it one day? Like I just want to make sure. And we just read it really, really fast and we went through it. And afterwards, Todd was like, yes. And then he was like, well, but how did you know? I said, because, it's in the rhythm of writing. And I said, and also we are, what's the word, indoctrinated. We are cultured in that vernacular. Like, we all watch those movies on TV. So it's like you hear the cadence, the tone, the whatever. It's like, it's there, it's like in your brain. You don't even know it's there.
Moore viewed Kathy as the idyllic American wife archetype, composed, manicured, proper. So to fit that mold, she modeled her voice on Doris Day, lowering it to a gentle melodic register. Beautiful, but not erotic.
Oh, Mona, really? You must ignore him, Mr. Farnsworth.
Charmed.
I do hope you enjoy your stay.
She puts on this Doris Day persona when the illusion is working, when picking out new decor, when showing off her perfect home, when tucking in her loving husband. But there's something uncanny about her. It feels unnatural, like this woman and this life couldn't possibly be real, which, of course, they aren't. And when the illusion breaks, when Moore needs to convey that her predicament is indeed deeply serious, she pulls back, playing it straight to retain credibility with modern audiences. Haynes fills in the emotion with stylistic flourishes. So take, for example, the scene in which Frank first discusses his sexuality with her. They're swamped in darkness. She whispers her lines sadly. She's resigned.
Kathy.
I can't.
This is a melodrama, but this isn't a melodramatic reaction. She's tame, considered, and easy to take seriously. According to Moore, that kind of calibration is possible because of how detailed Haynes' preparation is. She's the kind of actor who wants to see a shot list and wants to know exactly how she will be framed so she understands what her performance is adding to any given scene.
It's like I always say about Todd, I think I said this to you too, Natalie, before we started working. I was like, Todd does all the work for you. It's so relaxing. It's so wonderful to walk into, one of his films because you're literally held by the frame.
With Haynes so clearly relating what she's doing and why, she's freed to focus on her contribution.
She is an actor for the medium of film, how she understands the lens. There's things that happen that I can't even see in the room when we're shooting them with her, that I only see later on film or when I watch the dailies or when I watch what we've done. And so there's this sense of understanding, a restraint and an understatement that again was so fully formed when I first met her that was pretty remarkable.
Far From Heaven was a critical darling, with Moore earning some of the most raving reviews of her career. Manohla Jarvis wrote at the LA Times that what Moore does with her role is so beyond the parameters of what we call great acting that it nearly defies categorization. Although it's the least naturalistic of the performances because the character is an artificial construction, yet another imitation of life, it's also the most devastating. The film picked up a number of awards on the festival circuit, including the Volpe Cup for Best Actress at the Venice Film Festival, and also from critics groups. It swept the New York Critics Circle, except more oddly, though she picked up National Board of Review, Los Angeles Critics' Choice, and an Independent Spirit Award for Best Actress, which apparently used to be much less casual. Here's what Julianne wore, and just for fun, here's what Scarlett Johansson wore. Todd Haynes also won a number of awards for this film and entered into a mainstream awards conversation for the first time. For Best Original Screenplay, he earned his first, and as of publication of this video, only Academy Award nomination to date, which is annoying. Moore, of course, was also nominated for Best Actress, though she lost by a nose, as they like to say, to Nicole Kidman for playing Virginia Woolf in The Hours, for which Moore was also nominated for Best Supporting Actress. That role, which I think is actually very much in dialogue with much of her work with Haynes, and low-key is maybe my favorite performance of hers, capped off an incredible year for her, a year which launched both of them into a revered status. Haynes and Moore's next two collaborations, I'm Not There and Wonderstruck, differ slightly in that Moore's performances do not anchor the films, nor are they very thematically similar to Safe and Far From Heaven. However, both films still serve as further examples of the genre dance that Haynes and Moore do. I'm Not There is a biopic of Bob Dylan that is so unconventional and experimental that it might not even be appropriate to call it a biopic. I'd be lying if I said I understand exactly what this film is doing and saying at all times. I don't know anything about Bob Dylan, and this definitely seems like a situation where the more you know about him, the more enriching you're going to find this film. Nevertheless, I find I'm Not There absolutely exhilarating on every level. Several actors play fictionalized versions of Dylan at different stages in his career, with each version elaborating on a different facet of the singer-songwriter's persona. Cate Blanchett, for example, plays Jude Quinn, a take on Dylan in his Don't Look Back era, as he begins incorporating electric guitars, while Marcus Carl Franklin plays a young Dylan riding the rails and calling himself Guthrie. Moore appears as Alice Fabian, a fictionalized version of Joan Baez, a very prominent folk singer-songwriter in her own right, who also famously had a relationship with Dylan in the early 1960s. In this storyline, Christian Bale plays a Dylan who is praised for his political messaging and protest songs. The story is framed as a typical music industry documentary, complete with talking heads, archival footage, and of course, black and white photographs.
Someday they're going to write an article about us, and it's going to be like black and white photos of us like.
This role, though a pretty minor one in the film, still asks Moore to tackle yet another genre, resulting in yet another voice. In this quote-unquote documentary, her voice takes on a gravelly texture of a veteran singer. She pauses to think, staring at the ceiling or the floor to gather her thoughts.
Yeah, I asked him, what what did he think made us so different? And he said it was simple.
Haynes told cineast, "She has a sort of attitude and an ego. She's not some poor, put-upon folk singer. In a way, she's the sturdiest character that Julianne has portrayed in any of my films." 2017's Wonderstruck is Haynes' version of a kids' movie. Based on a graphic novel and original screenplay by Brian Selznick, Wonderstruck intercuts between the timelines of two deaf children, separated by several decades on their respective trips to New York City. In the 1920s, Rose makes her journey to see her mother, a famous silent film actress. In the 1970s, Ben arrives to look for the father he never knew. Moore has a more substantial role in this film, playing both the silent actress mother and the older version of Rose in the 1970s, where it's revealed that everything is connected. Filmed as a silent film, the 1920s portion plugs her into yet another anachronism. She uses her body to convey her thoughts in a medium where verbal dialogue has no use. At one point, Moore acts in a silent film within the silent film, in a riff on Lillian Gish's 1928 film, The Wind. In the 1970s portion as Rose, Moore plays it straight. Haynes uses this dual casting as a storytelling device, drawing a familial connection by having Moore play both mother and daughter, having them resemble one another. Still, I question whether Moore should have actually played the older Rose, given that she's a deaf character. I don't think the device or Moore's skill justifies that, particularly if you're adding prosthetics to both age her and adjust some of her physical characteristics. You can just hire an actual deaf actor. According to the New York Times, Mr. Haynes said there was a discussion about hiring a deaf actor for the adult Rose, but he said the film needed stars to get financing, and the only role that offered itself that kind of status was the role of Rose. He turned to Miss Moore. She took on the responsibility of that character and the research with great seriousness. Tom Humphreys, a deaf professor at UCSD who advised on the film, said that the movie succeeded way better than most, but he also said that you can't achieve authenticity without much more participation of deaf people in all aspects of a movie about deaf people. I think it's honestly quite obvious that Moore is a hearing person who learned sign language here, and I would have preferred to see Marlee Matlin get this role. This brings us up to present day. Natalie Portman had been looking for something to work on with Todd Haynes and sent him the script for May-December in 2020 as a possibility. Although the screenplay was brilliantly written by Sammy Birch, inspired by the Mary Kay Letourneau scandal of the late 90s, it feels like it could have been written by Haynes, given that it hits many of the major themes he likes to work with: domesticity, femininity, constructions of identity, fame, the entertainment business, etc., etc. Of course he was interested, and once he realized he needed to cast a 60-something-year-old actress, who does he slip it to but Julianne Moore? In May-December, Portman plays Elizabeth, an actress who travels to Savannah, Georgia to research for an upcoming role. She will be playing and shadowing Gracie Atherton Yu, a woman who, at 36 years old, had an affair with a 7th grader named Joe. Gracie was, of course, imprisoned for this, but upon release, reunited with Joe, married, and started a family with him. Elizabeth swears that her portrayal of Gracie will be sensitive and human, and enters their lives as the children are set to leave for college. Her presence inspires Joe to re-examine his life and the power dynamics that led him to this point. In many ways, May-December is a continuation of Haynes and Moore's work in Safe and Far From Heaven, solidifying Moore as the avatar for one of Haynes' major interests as a filmmaker: the domestic lives of white women. This is the third time Moore has portrayed a housewife, the third time they've considered the values that govern and sustain suburban life, the third time her character clings to an archetype of femininity at odds with reality. At the same time, while May-December extends some of the themes and ideas of Haynes' work, it also completely subverts them. Gracie, like Kathy, acts in two registers. In both cases, there is a public and private self, different facets of the same woman that protect her from the outside world. But in May December, this act is duplicitous and manipulative. There's the way she acts with Joe, demanding, childish, overly emotional, and the way she performs for Elizabeth. She's the composed, feminine, happy homemaker who has nothing to apologize for. Gracie, unlike Kathy and Carol, actually is in control. Haynes told Sight and Sound, "The women in most of my stories don't have access to their desires or their will the way these women do. The women in the earlier films are much more subjugated in different kinds of ways from film to film." The only thing that gives you any sympathy for either woman in May December is in relief against the other. The power of each is relative and embedded in larger systems. So you keep shifting back and forth between trusting and mistrusting one or the other. It's not like a Todd Haynes film because the women are so difficult to like and care about. It's the children you care about. Gracie's femininity was key to Moore's understanding of the character.
And for her, it's a great love story. She met her prince. She was the princess. They fell in love and lived happily ever after. And for that to happen, she needed to elevate this boy to a man, which makes her, she's the child and he's the man. So that's the narrative that she's pushing forward. Her childlike quality, her hyper femininity, somebody who feels very genderized, is, allows herself to be like, I'm the child, I'm the girl, he's the man. But there's a big difference between the story that she's telling and the reality.
It also shouldn't be surprising at this point in the video that this emphasis on Gracie's femininity and childish nature led Moore to a vocal choice. Her lisp was not written in the screenplay, but instead invented to both underline her ideas about the character and assist the narrative.
We associate that with children. I made a joke today to somebody about, you remember your kids are so little, when they're really little, they sound like they have accents all the time because they just have these baby voices.
Yeah.
So I thought it'd be interesting if somebody had that. And it also gave Natalie something really concrete
to do.
She doesn't make this direct connection herself, but this choice could also have its roots in her personal experience when researching for a biopic herself. She often, for example, talks about working on perfecting Sarah Palin's voice for Game Change because she knew how recognizable it would be to the average viewer. May December is also a great example of how Moore can lean on Haynes to tell his story with frame and style. In describing Far From Heaven, Haynes wrote about how the love and pain depicted is almost too big for any single character to contain. So it spills into the music, the wardrobe, and decor, the colors and shadows on the screen. The style allows expression to be spread into nonverbal arenas, displacing the desires and villainy of the characters onto literally the walls and clothes, even the narrative forms they inhabit. This could very well also be said about May December. The delusion and dishonesty that lurks beneath the surface of the characters' interactions is expressed through Haynes' direction, most obviously, I think, through the music. The score, adapted from Michel Legrand's score of the 1971 film The Go-Between, is jarring and ominous. As it plays in the opening credits over footage of butterflies, he signals that the story to come will be troubling and uneasy. Haynes timed the musical cues in advance and would literally play them on set to keep this tense mood in the back of everyone's mind. He pairs this music with long, static takes, like in Safe, forcing the viewer to sit in these uncomfortable, combative situations to watch as these women become mirror images of each other. It's intimate, but also isolating and distancing. Portman's eyes are piercing as they observe, while Moore's are deadened and devilish. At the same time, these long takes leave room for humor, which Burt includes in the screenplay. When looking back at age gap films, this is something that Haynes noticed that they shared.
Some of those films, particularly Manhattan and The Graduate, use an incredibly elegant, minimalist sort of visual language to convey, and they're both comedies, but it's the restraint of the camera and the frame, to me, that makes the comedy in both films, in Manhattan and in The Graduate, so effective. And if The Graduate was conventionally shot with a million cuts back and forth, the jokes would be gone. The timing of the actors would be compromised.
So for example, in this scene, Elizabeth accompanies Gracie to a flower arrangement class, where Gracie introduces her to the woman leading the class.
Thank you, Lydia. This is Elizabeth. She's playing me in a movie, so I'm trying to show her a good time. That I don't doubt.
Elizabeth is taken aback by this woman's brazen shade, but for Gracie, it goes in one ear and out the other. The camera holds. Michael Koreski writes, "By the end of the film, we may be no closer to understanding Julianne Moore's Gracie, but we are also kept at a remove from Natalie Portman's Elizabeth, whose motivations and emotional attachments are just as inchoate and predicated on the exploitation of others. It's to this singular filmmaker's credit that we remain enthralled to these characters, problematic people who are nevertheless worthy of our time, consideration, and humane fascination." There's a lot of great work to choose from, but if I had to pick, May December is probably my favorite of their collaborations to date. If it's any indication of what Moore and Haynes still have left to say with their creative relationship, I can't wait to see what they do next. It's award season now, and I'd put my money on Julianne Moore and the May December team being a huge part of that conversation. Someone else I know we'll be talking a lot about this year is Lily Gladstone, whose performance in Killers of the Flower Moon has enthralled critics and audiences and earned her a number of awards already. If Killers of the Flower Moon made you interested in Gladstone and what she's been up to and making so far in her career, Mubi's got you covered. Mubi is a curated streaming service dedicated to elevating great cinema from around the globe. Each film is thoughtfully hand-picked by Mubi's curators to bring you the best of cinema at your fingertips, streaming anytime, anywhere. This month, they premiered a Performers We Love collection highlighting Lily Gladstone. It's so great to see all of these collected in one place, which I haven't seen done literally anywhere else, and it's part of the reason I think Mubi is so special and a great subscription for any cinephile to have. From Kelly Reichardt's Certain Women, the film that convinced Scorsese she should do Killers, to her Gotham Award-winning performance in An Unknown Country, it's all there for you to peruse and become more familiar with an actor I hope we're going to see much more of in the future. You can watch all of them for free simply by clicking the link in my description. Head over to mubi.com/BeKindRewind, and that's right, you will get a whole world of cinema at your fingertips for free for a whole month. Get your month at mubi.com/BeKindRewind today.